few examples of some native plants, but I can give you resources where you can find very long lists of native plants as well as some places to find them. So again, if you have questions along the way, feel free to ask, and I'll try not to lose my train of thought. So, yeah.
Some of these lines.
Is that possible?
Very hard to see.
Yeah.
We'll do it like
Oh,
this.
beautiful.
Sorry about that.
I think I need a computer person.
You have a
Oh.
clicker?
I know I have a clicker, but this needs to go away for it to work.
Sorry.
And I thought I could, my thing, I could hit it and it
Yeah,
wasn't going away.
not a touch screen, I'm so sorry. And you've got your
Yeah,
clicker.
so you're good. Okay, so we're gonna look for just a minute at why we landscape in the first place. So sort of, we as a human race, as a people, we've been gardening since the dawn of time, basically. Somehow manipulating our environments, whether that's to provide places to live, whether it's to make places where we can grow food, for aesthetic reasons, for all sorts of purposes, practically as well as sort of the fluff and stuff, the aesthetic reasons why. So plants have been used for religious significance, often to display affluence, for shelter and protection from the elements, to provide privacy for lots of reasons, in terms of just giving ourselves a comfortable place to be on the planet. So the reasons that we do this are also influenced, though, by our economies, our political leanings, even our values, and our personal aesthetics. So we see gardening and garden trends change often and very generationally. So all of these things influence how the next trend comes along oftentimes. So it also reflects sort of values of our culture as a whole, and also helps us integrate and mesh with those other cultures, for instance. For many, many years now, we've begun to see a trend in more environmentally friendly sort of ways to garden and to landscape. We see this sort of based on the evolution of our society, seeing the impact of what we've done sort of landscape-wise, not only on our personal sort of environments, but also on the global environment and our society as a whole. So we begin to think about how our personal landscaping has started to impact the world, as it were. So more people are becoming a lot more cognizant, a lot more aware of what we do as individuals and the impact it has sort of beyond our little yard or 100 acres, whatever, wherever you find yourself. So there are three examples on the bottom of this slide. The Boboli Gardens from Florence, Italy in the 1500s. Obviously a landscape that was intended to display the affluence of the family. Castle Howard in Yorkshire, England in the center. It began early in the 1700s. There's a little bit more sort of what was considered naturalized landscape going on. Actually a designed landscape itself that was intended to look more naturalized, but we see how even sort of formed that feels. And then the third slide is the Monticello Grove from the late early 1800s. So you can see sort of the progression of not only the aesthetics, but also the intention of each of these properties. Very Monticello, the grove was intended to look very natural, very wild, as it were, even though it's a very manipulated space. So we can see that landscaping can range in the aesthetic of what the final product is too. So some of the other benefits of landscaping, though, as we move along, which now this disappeared. So maybe we have a little more technical difficulty. It's not doing again. It was still not there.
I think sometimes you lose the connection, so I think you just
Gotcha.
click into the screen and see.
Yeah. Okay, so back to how the other benefits of landscaping can sort of show up. And again, looking at the emphasis of sort of the more environmental movement that we're seeing these days. And also the focus on using native plants, native meaning, we'll get into that in a bit, but sort of being plants from the space where you are. We also take a look at how you can merge kind of the wild look and the more manicured look. So we can talk about the aesthetics a little bit, but also we want to consider the environmental benefits. So you can see air quality, reducing energy costs by providing shade and or more sun, depending. Also the advantage of filtering rainwater, especially as it leaves pavement or areas of pavement or roofs. So also to just mention an author, Sarah Stein, if you haven't heard of her, she's written a book called Noah's Garden, which is about transforming suburban landscapes kind of back into a more ecologically sound environment without looking too wild or too unkept. It's a really nice book to read. It's not very lengthy, but she has some really, really wonderful concepts and ideas about how to make that happen. We actually see some of this in Blacksburg to a large degree in places like Preston Forest and Laurel Ridge, where they kind of tucked houses into a sort of the broader forest, as it were, but also some of the suburban neighborhoods and even some of the new developments where they're requiring a specific percentage of open space. But again, Sarah Stein sort of gives us as individuals ways to keep those connections that can help a whole community sort of be bound by a way to help native birds and other animals and pollinators flourish a little bit better. So when you start thinking about how you might want to go native in your own yard, you can think about how your space kind of contributes to the larger picture. And it doesn't mean that everybody has to plant the same thing or be solely native in terms of what they plant. But it gives us an idea about how we fit into the bigger picture and how we can contribute to a community that at large is sort of more connected in a better way. So where do we begin when we start talking about how to use native plants or how to make a garden in our space? So we want to think about how to look at our site overall. And many of you may be long-term gardeners, or you may be just getting started. So I hope this doesn't feel like old news to you, and hopefully you can apply some of these things even to a very established garden space. So when you think about looking at your site, you want to look at what features you have already and what features you want to keep and what makes sense in terms of how you're using your space. So there are ways to think about augmenting a space you already have established and or starting something from a clean slate. Again, you want to look at your overall site, not only how that works in your space, but also how you want to help it connect to the larger community. So you can think about sort of what covenants, restrictions might be in your neighborhood, if you're in a neighborhood, what the shape of your land is, like what the topography is, and how that influences how water moves on your property. And when you think about that, even if you're in a very suburban setting, think about the rain that falls on the roof and on the paved areas, not only on your property, but also the surrounding properties. Like, how is that influenced by the shape of your ground, as it were? Does your site necessarily might lend itself to a particular type of planting? Perhaps there are large trees around you. Does it make sense to continue that theme, as it were, or continue to develop that type of environment? And or do you have a lot of exposure and you need to create a little more shelter? So you might want to plant more trees, for instance. And or is your site really wet? Does it sort of naturally trend toward a wetland or a bog or something, even if it's just a corner? But so there are lots of those kinds of considerations when looking at where you're going to be planting. So when we look at sort of how we use our space, and once you sort of have an understanding of the elements that are part of your property and how they can contribute to, then we want to start looking at some of the elements of design, as we said. So there are structural things that you can begin to lay out to start to define the space where you are, and or the space that you want to create. So these elements can be articulated in several different ways, and it will depend on your style, or what sort of plant materials or what sort of landscape features that you may want to emphasize and or that you may want to shield. This sketch is actually of historic Smithfield, but it seemed very clear in terms of showing kind of the major elements of design in terms of how you want to start to define your space. So the edges are maybe sort of the edge of your property, or they might be edges within your property, depending on how you want to define how you use the space, or it may depend on whether you have a wet spot versus a dry spot, or how you want to create definition between spaces and uses of your property. They can be either built structures. You can define edges either with built elements or plantings, or even just a line of ground, as it were. So there are different ways to define these elements as well. And the paths help you understand how you want to move through your space, how you want to be able to access your space, how you want to direct visitors or someone else who might be visiting your space. Is it easy for them to read? Does it actually guide you around the way that you want it to? And does it also, you can use paths to create even a sense of mystery, or it's maybe to emphasize a particular plant or building. You can also think about focal points that you want to establish and how you want to.
I know, but I can't figure out how to do that.
Vision and or other people's vision.
I've done that.
Where you want them to be looking. Again, whether it's you want them to look at your home or whether maybe you don't. So it's all going to depend on what you want to emphasize in terms of a focal point. A focal point, again, can be a built structure, a statue, it could even be a plant itself. So you can start to think about then how you set these things up so that there is a balance or a rhythm in terms of how you move about your space and how you want to populate that space, again, either with built elements and or plant material. So when you also want to start thinking about how you're going to use your space. Like if you are a little sun baby and want to have a lot of sun, then there's a consideration about whether you plant trees, what type of trees and where they might go or where they might need to be. If you have a lot of solar panels, consider like where plant material needs to be so that they are accessed both by the sun and for any repairs you might need. How does your space relate to your house or your other built structures? So thinking about giving context to the actual physical structures you have. And do you want or need privacy, and how much, and from whom, and what parts of your property might you want more privacy than others? And what's your personal style? Like, what do you like in terms of aesthetics and style of planting? An English garden is very different than an English boxwood garden, for instance. So there are different ways to think about how you feel comfortable in a space. This is a very subconscious thing that we often don't even realize. But as you are either walking through your neighborhood or even downtown or through a park, I challenge you next time to think about what's around you next time you're outside and how it makes you feel. Because sometimes we're just walking through a space to get to another place, or we're not really thinking about why we really want to get through a certain space, or why we might want to linger in another space. So a lot of people use the example of the drill field on campus. And if you take a walk through there when there aren't a million students there, just take a walk through there and see how it makes you feel. And then think about what is around you and why it might make you feel that way. And I have my theories, but I'm not going to tell you. Because it's nice to be able to experience those kinds of spaces and just to see how it makes you feel. And have you ever been in a larger city, for instance, and just like had to get out of the space? Like it made you feel really uncomfortable. And maybe it was too closed in, or maybe it was too closed in by too much vegetation. You know, it doesn't always have to be built structures, but the way that we relate to a space, especially outdoors, makes a big difference whether you sort of realize it or not. And how you create your own space needs to be comfortable when you're there. So those are some things to think about, just in terms of like, how closed in do you want it? How much privacy do you want? How closed off do you want it to be, or how open? So those are kind of the things that we're thinking about when we are talking about how to make your space make sense for yourself. So again, this can be determined by what you plant, where you plant it, or it can be in combination with some built things as well. So when we're talking about plants, we're going to be thinking today more specifically about native things. So this is one definition of native, and what that means is that a plant is naturally occurring in the region where you live. So when you go to a nursery, especially a more commercial nursery, and it says native, read the tag a little more closely, because it may be native to the United States, but it might not be native to Virginia. And that can be problematic. I mean, there are, I'm sure every state in the union has an issue with some type of native plant that has gone berserk because it's not necessarily native to that region. So they may be beautiful, and they may be helpful, but not all native plants labeled as native are necessarily native to our region. So that's just one thing to sort of be aware of when you're shopping. So again, when we think about using native plants, it doesn't necessarily mean that where we're planting them has to look like the woods. Like, it doesn't have to be what some people would consider wild. So we'll take a look at some of the ways we can use plants so that you can gain different types of aesthetics. Let's see, did I miss anything about that? So we'll talk a little bit too about non-native species. And there are non-native species that are not necessarily invasive. So some people want to use exclusively natives. And some people want to combine things that are not native necessarily. So it's also important to understand that not all non-native things are invasive. What we want to be careful about are those things that are invasive. So a non-native thing that may not cause problems would not necessarily be an issue if you want to use it in your space. Just because it's in your space and it's invasive doesn't mean it doesn't leave your space. That's why it's called invasive. So we're not always aware of what might be invasive. And oftentimes even the nursery trade is not aware of it until it's too late. So it's like plants, just like everything else, have been cultivated and bred for certain reasons, depending on, again, all those cultural things, the evolution of our society, what people were after, all of those things influence the types of plants that we can find in the trade. So, you know, like the Bradford pear that's gone berserk. It was bred mostly for urban areas. It's a type, it stays very, you don't have to prune it a lot. It goes bananas in places we don't want it to go bananas. Nobody was really aware of that when they cultivated it necessarily. It's become a problem over the years, and the more broadly it's been spread throughout the state. So sometimes we don't always know. So sticking to more natives and or native cultivars is always a safer bet if that's on your agenda. So in this first picture is a designed meadow, for instance. So most of the plants in this meadow were either annuals or native species. It is in a sense, a manicured space, but the aesthetic of it is not necessarily manicured. Maybe managed is a better word than manicured. In the middle slide is an example of sort of just an edge that is using boxwoods and some annuals, I think. So it's more formalized. You can find native plants that can do this, but it's also an example of a non-native that's not invasive. So a lot less problematic. The third one is, one of our favorite barberries because deer won't eat it. Usually. But again, it's very invasive, and something we figured out is getting spread throughout the woods, even in our little corner of the world here, because birds love the berries. So it's being planted everywhere. And they are now cultivating varieties that are sterile. So if you just have to have a barberry, check on the tag or ask the person who's selling it if it's a sterile cultivar. So those are some options in terms of being able to use non-natives that are not invasive. And again, this may depend on how you feel about using natives or not. So a lot of the benefits of natives, though, sort of outweigh a lot of the reasons to not use them. So again, considering that they're going to thrive a little more easily because they're naturally occurring and they like the weather, they like the rainfall, the amount we get or don't get, they like the temperatures that we have. So they're just going to be a hardier plant generally. They often are able to contribute a little better to soil fertility. They help retain soil a lot better. Again, even the root structures are more inclined to fit better into our environment. So they can help reduce erosion. They usually require less fertilization, again, because the soil that we have is the soil that they need, that they want. The nutrients are in the soil that they grow in the best. So they also contribute to, again, the overall health of the larger ecosystem. All of the things above we just talked about help in that regard. So they also can help resist some of the alien invasive species. Oftentimes they're crowded out though, so that's just one more plug to use more natives. So, and there are such a huge variety of plants that you can find many that will contribute to adding more texture, color, aesthetic that you want to achieve in your garden. So we're going to look at some ways to use plants. And you can see in these examples, everything from sort of a really formal to a much less formal. And these are two on the bottom, the one nearest me and in the center are both hemlock. So they've been manicured to look much more formal than the one on the end, for instance. But these are all ways to use some native plants and get very different aesthetics if you're defining an edge that cleanly. Also in terms of how your path or what type of path you may want to establish in your space, which can help not only define the space itself or the spaces within your space, but also how to guide you through and or guide visitors through. So if you're thinking about a park, for instance, or something like that, then a path can help guide people through that space visually as well as physically. And we see here a mown path at the top, a driveway that's actually lined with juniper. So again, it's a native plant, but gives you a very, very defined way of moving, even though you have a paved driveway. The undulating path has daylilies, but just to give you an idea about the style of path you can use.
Recording in progress.
We'll say paved, but pavers, as opposed to those on the bottom, which are much more sort of naturalized. So again, just to give you some examples of very different aesthetics in terms of the types of paths and how they can be defined, both with sort of the hardscape, the stones or the brick pavers or whatever type of paver itself, as well as the vegetation and how it guides you visually through a space. Then again, establishing focal points. And so again, it could be a built structure, it could be a plant itself. In the top photo, there is a very interesting plant in the foreground, which leads your eye to the background or the mountains. So you get not only a closer view and focal point, but it also helps you extend your view in the garden, for instance. In the center, the structure of that tree is emphasized by the backdrop of the evergreen. So that's one way to establish a focal point, and one way to use like a deciduous tree as a focal point, especially in the winter. So oftentimes you'll see redbud trees, which are very dark in terms of their bark, but their branching structure is also very structural, as it were. They have zigzaggy stems, they have very rigid branching, and if it's put in the right place or in front of something, then that becomes a really interesting focal point even in winter. And in the third slide, you can see that a built structure is kind of used as a focal point too. So garden spaces, they can be very simple, even just the edge of a patio, a hardscaped area. Maybe it's a simple border between lawns, maybe between you and your neighbor. Or it could be, you want to add a little mystery to your yard. And you can do that, again, through the use of plants, where you place them, and how you move people through your space. So also when we think about borrowing views, like I mentioned a second ago, so like the meadow on the bottom corner, like they don't own all of what you see there, but they can borrow the views that you get depending on, like they could have put a big tree right there and you wouldn't have any view extending beyond your property. But you can also emphasize that view by how you use plants in your space. So that's one way to feel and to extend your property visually. And if you want to open things up a little bit more, again, sort of borrowing the view. You can also see, like in the other slide at the bottom, how formal that build space is. Very angular, very clean lines. And they've used a fringe tree. as part of their planting. So again, using native plants in a very formal space is quite pretty. So again, we'll go back to, it doesn't have to be wild, but if that's your style, and maybe you don't consider that wild, just sort of throwing that out there as a term. We'll say less formal. And you can see the difference in terms of how these plants are used that are native species. So we see some of these examples of native perennials. The red is a lobelia or cardinal flower. It likes a lot of water. They usually grow in the woods near streams. I've seen them at Canadapas ponds, and they're very beautiful. I've had one in my garden in one spot that only lasted one season, and I was very sad. And then it popped up on the other side of my house, and it's been extremely happy. But it was much shadier and much more damp there. So sometimes if you have a plant and think it's gone, it might just have moved, depending on what kind of space or place it might need. So these are just, again, just a very few examples of some of the perennials, but also the types of not only color, but texture that you can get from using native plants. All of that makes a big difference in terms of how you're going to be using them and how you want to, again, emphasize or create space in your yard. So some of the shrubs, the pieris, a very sweet, sort of early blooming shrub that's a woodland shrub, so it does well in shade if you have a lot of shade. The flame azalea, if you're ever in the woods in the late spring, I guess, early summer, they're stunning. I mean, they always catch your eye. So again, we have natives that have really bright colors, which might be something that you want to use in your garden to draw somebody's eye to a particular part of the yard, and or it might be your focal point. Something as simple as the American beautyberry in the center. This is a great fall plant because that's when you see the berries, and it just sort of sings in your garden with the fall foliage, and has this really interesting and very unique colored berry. The clethra is a very, very good pollinator plant, and again, very nice fall color. Most plants are going to give you more than one season of interest, and we don't often consider that and or think about that as an advantage of using native plants. But something like the witch hazel is going to bloom when nothing else is blooming. Winter is never going to end. Witch hazel will bloom for you. It also usually has a really nice color. There are several cultivars of witch hazels now, depending on like how strictly native you want to be. So oftentimes you'll find cultivars. Question. Are any of these native shrubs more deer resistant? Not necessarily. Yeah, so the question was, are some of these native shrubs or native plants more deer resistant? They're not deer resistant because they're native. So I'll leave it at that for a minute, but I'll address that in just a second. So we'll also look at a few trees. So there are trees, native trees, just about in any size you might need or want. So there are things like the fringe tree, which is not here in this picture, but it is cultivated often in the trade as a multi-trunk or a multi-stemmed tree. It can be let go as a shrub, or it can be trained as a single stem, but they stay fairly small, like less than 20 feet for a tree. So things like the redbud, the Cercis canadensis, or the dogwood, the cornus florida, they're in the 20, 25. So we consider those a rather small tree. So you can do anything from a small tree to like the oak, which is up here, which is going to be a giant tree. Not everybody has space for that, but there is a huge range in terms of sizes of trees and or flowering, deciduous, or evergreen as native trees. So some people are like, well, maybe if I can't get what I want because I have to stick to natives. It's like you can find what you need as a native plant, whether you're looking for something giant to grow, a smaller tree, something flowering, evergreen, lots and lots of choices in terms of what you might be needing or looking for. So, dear, the disclaimer is no plant is completely deer resistant. Plants that I have never known them to eat before, they have started eating in the last couple of years. So it's a challenge. We're in their space, they're in our space, they're hungry. We're weary of them eating our stuff.
Is there a naturally large number of deer around?
I don't know. The question was, is there a large number of deer around at the moment, like an extraordinarily large number? I don't know. I don't study the deer population, so I'm not sure if they have just tended to move a little differently and or if there's actually sort of a moving population. We'd have to find a wildlife person to ask that question to. So there are a few examples of plants that deer tend to bother less than others. If it's the newest thing in your yard, they will have a bite of it. And if there are 20 of them, they will all have a bite of it and it will be gone. So the disclaimer is if you plant something new, protect it. Like they're very habitual and they will just continue to go to a place where they have found food. So if you cage it, put repellent on it, do whatever you need to protect it when you first plant it, they're less likely to get in the habit of going to that plant or that space that you're planting. And that's my only advice. Sometimes that helps and it works. You almost have to do it every season as plants come up though, because they get rehabituated every time new plants come up. They're very curious. They want to know what it is and if it tastes good. So again, these things are things they tend to stay away from less, or they tend to not eat it to the ground if they do start to nibble on it. At the bottom is a wvu.edu website, and they have a really good plant list of deer-proof plants. So take it as you know, with a grain of salt. Rutgers University also has a pretty good list. I'm sure there are others as well, but those are two that are good references to sort of consult when you're thinking about more deer-resistant plants. So here's a list of some plant sales that are coming up that are going to be pretty much exclusive plants and native plants if you're interested in finding plants to use in your garden. I'll leave this up just a minute so that you have, you can take a picture or make notes about what might be coming up and convenient to you and or that you might want to check out in terms of plants that you can use in many ways. So I'll do a plug for the Native Plant Society since that's who I'm here representing, but June 10th will be their native plant sale at the Price House, which is on Wharton Street, where the Seeds program is located. And it's going to be like the 9 to 2 Brenda or something like that. Yeah. And there's a plant swap here at the library in the fall. Just keep kind of checking their website for when that's going to be. Has everybody got this? Some other places that you can find natives. Another plug for the Native Plant Society plant sale, but also there are more local nurseries that are either emphasizing restricting their plant options to natives and or at least having some natives in their inventory. So again, you can see that list has grown in the past couple of years. And at the bottom, there's actually a new nursery in Roanoke that has come up. Well, thank Brenda for this list. But those are some good places to find really interesting things that are, most of which are locally and or regionally grown, which can also make a difference in terms of how well or how quickly they may acclimate to our zone and or our planting area. The closer it's grown to us originally, the better off we are planting it, the better off the plant will be in terms of being able to establish itself pretty quickly. So here's a list of references and resources that I've used, both in this presentation as well as just generally. There's also, I don't know, did I include the Flora of Virginia? I'm not sure that made it on the list, but there's a new Flora of Virginia, which I'm pretty sure the library has a copy of. And I'm pretty sure Tech's library would have a copy too. Excellent reference, very thorough. And folks in the Native Plant Society would be able to connect to with one too, I'm pretty sure. So, yeah.
Want to tell about the app too?
Can you tell me?
Okay.
Because it's
Flora Virginia app. I pay for $20, but it's worth it, and it's based on the book version of Flora Virginia. Right? It's for ID, whatever else, but it's very useful, and you do update it on a regular basis.
so again, Brenda's just saying the Flora of Virginia has an app. It costs a bit, it costs like $20, but they update it continuously, and it's an excellent reference in terms of the Flora of Virginia. And it's very helpful in terms of being able to, again, look at things regionally, because even things that might be native to Virginia might not be native to Southwest Virginia. So it's always helpful to kind of look at those things.
Flora Virginia app also tells you which counties they have taken, whatever the word is, that they prove that it's in that county.
Oh, gotcha.
It tells you which ones are invasive, which ones are naturalized, which ones are native.
Okay.
And it does specific details.
So, and again, Brenda's just explaining in that app, it will let you know what region each plant is native to, and which plants might be invasive and which plants might be naturalized, which we didn't really talk about, but so again, a plant might not be native, but it might be naturalized to an area, which means it's kind of fit itself into the native ecosystem. It's not taken over, it's not crowding anything out, but it's pretty happy here, so it'll just stay. So that's not necessarily horrible, it's just, you know, it's not exclusively native. So there is a difference between naturalized and native. And naturalized is not horrible, it's not invasive, but if you're just trying to be exclusively native, you might pay attention to that. So, again, some really good references, and yes.
Yes, we have some open space, a lot of open space in my neighborhood. And the Russian olive bush has taken over everything. How do we get rid of that, except one by one? And without using the poisons, or is there a way to get rid of them easily?
There's not an easy way to do it. And if you don't want to use any sort of herbicide or anything, I mean, one way to use an herbicide that's a little less harmful is like to cut it and paint that stump, not
Just
just
with
spray it
regular
in
paint.
spray. Yeah,
Like
like,
paint to the.
yeah, with the herbicide.
With the herbicide.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
Okay,
or
gotcha.
just spray on that stump, not
Okay.
everywhere. But it's just a painstaking process.
Okay.
It's, yeah.
We also have crown vetch.
The other thing is to cut and cut. Every time you see grow, cut it down, it'll eventually. So you just have to cut and cut and cut.
We can get volunteers.
It's hard.
A good website to check or how to get rid of face with IKEA is Google Prisms. That's a good way to get all sorts of different methods and everything.
Blue Ridge Prism is a good website to use to help get rid of invasive. So it's got several options in terms of how to try to take care of those things. And I was thinking there was one other thing that I can't remember. This quote is from Martha Brooks Hutchinson. She was one of the first landscape architects. Women landscape architects, I'll say. She was, I'm reading my notes here because I forgot. She lived in New Jersey, and Bamboo Brook was the property. They call it Bamboo Brook now. But her property is now an educational system. It's like 100 acres or something, but they've turned it into an educational center. And she had designed her property so that her views were very intentional. And she cited like her house, the formal gardens in ways that couldn't be observed necessarily from outside without having to, it's like she didn't have to plant huge hedges of giant trees. She didn't have to do, like giant mounds of earth but she used the site she had in ways to control views and or to emphasize views, and created formal gardens and very sort of less formal and wild places. Like part of the property, it was intentionally left native. Anyway, I just love this quote. And I like to think that we all have a little bit of garden spirit in ourselves, and also as we add more natives to our garden, we give our garden a little more spirit too. I'm happy to take any other questions, and thank you all again for letting me come and speak, and thank you for being here. And that's all for today. Yeah.
Such an opportunity because this room is full of people who care about native plants, obviously, and are trying to add them. And I think that we have to remember that we're gardening for insects. If you think about the fact that there are all these little birds that fly hundreds, thousands of miles to come here to live for just 2.5 months every single year, and then return back into the southern. One reason, and that's for caterpillars. And so it's really good to start tuning into which plants really provide a lot more of those kinds of opportunities for insects. So I just bought a new book that I've been kind of talking about to people, and that is called Gardening for Moths, how many species are being benefited as a host plant for tree shrubs and herbaceous things. It's really a good one.
And thank you for bringing that up. We didn't touch on it specifically, but just in terms of the larger ecosystem and being a part of that. So what you plant matters because it all contributes again to the larger ecosystem that we're part of, even in this little corner of the world. So thank you for bringing that up, Barbara. And also that the fact that we plant things to attract insects is important. Because some people are like, I don't want bugs. Bugs are part of it. So we really do want to plant things that have bugs too. So
Avoid pesticides.
avoid pesticides. Yeah, and another good reason to use natives because you usually don't need them as much. If you know. Any other questions?
Do we need to be concerned about forest fire?
Pardon?
Do we need to be concerned about forest fire?
Do we need to be concerned about forest fires? Well, we've had a lot of those, red alert warnings lately because of the dry weather and the wind and everything. I think we need to be very cognizant, very aware of that and sort of pay attention to those warnings. We're not necessarily as exposed as folks out west. And usually we have enough moisture to keep things tamped down. But somebody who's in the forestry department could answer you more thoroughly, but I don't think that's a top concern for us at this point. Other questions?
There's another question back in that area.
Yeah, I just wonder what people are thinking about the use of pesticides for like on tree peppers and things that are so far. Taking pesticides, no.
Well, I guess I say for the better good.
Yeah.
I think like the autumn, you cut it, then you get 4 more stems, and you cut it, you get 6 more stems, and every time you cut it, it becomes, more and more of a thicket.
It's like, and the Atlantis is similar, like it's alleliopathic. So it not only is taking up space, it's like killing things that are in its root zone. So to me, it's like an herbicide in that instance makes sense if you can keep it contained to what you're cutting.
Actually, my in-laws had their arborists come over and they used a technique where they used a syringe and syringe fed good stuff for this particular plant. I wonder if you could syringe feed the pesticide so that it went directly to the thing you were trying to kill. Yeah.
And again, the website Brenda mentioned probably has these another options in terms of how to deal with that very specifically. So,
Right.
yeah, a lot of times you just paint, you might have to do it more than once, but that's sort of an easy way to take care of it. So,
Yeah, Blue Ridge Prison is really good for that kind of advice. Since we're a little over the time, I think if you're still around for a little bit, people can still ask you questions. I forgot to mention that we're giving away a copy of this book that will be a discussion group. There'll be a discussion at Blacksburg Books, the Spicy with the Butterfly book. So if you want to make sure we have your name and email address, either on a slip. There's more people here and online. So either fill out a slip or put it there, and I'll do the drawing differently. We also sponsor a sustainable garden tour, and the first one of those will be in May. Also, it's happening during the Blacksburg Bike Festival week, so it will be bike accessible. You don't have to ride your bike, but if you want to ride your bike, you'll be able to ride between the 2 locations. So we just want to thank everybody again for coming, and thank Lori again.
Great crowd.
Right.